Okay, we're gonna finish up our chapter notes today. Again, your test is on Friday. Okay, some of your classmates are writing right now. That is because they are away Thursday, Friday. We were talking yesterday about some of the changes before and after the charter. Today we're gonna look more at after the charter. Particularly prior to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for people in Canada to have laws made or changed. It was based off more or less the English common law system, in which you go to a court, raise your concern, and maybe that continues up the level of courts. A bill could be made, a law could be passed based off of prior legal decision making. That's how English common law works. Okay, that's kind of how our modern Western legal system works. If they were to make a decision in 1960, if something similar were to happen in 1970, the court case, what do they call them? The judge would look at the 1960 case and they would say, well, what was determined back then? Based on that, they'll make a decision. Okay, so they build on the history of cases. Anyways, after the Charter of Rights and Freedoms comes in, it's a slightly different process, although it's very similar. They entrench the rights of French-speaking people amongst many other people. In 1988, the Supreme Court decision, the law can require signs to use French, but cannot prohibit the use of English in addition. The law can require French to be more prominent than English. Okay, so this is again looking at the signage. Now, obviously since 1988, things have changed in Quebec. And for those of you who've gone, for those of you who go, you'll notice there's very little English displayed anywhere. Like there is very little French displayed anywhere here in Alberta, or most of Canada outside Quebec. Okay, but you cannot say, no, you're not allowed to have English. You can simply choose to have it in smaller print. Okay, but you must have both. Do you have a question?
Another place that uses French is Ontario.
Yeah, here and there, right? I thought we went over the slide. Okay, so 2005 Supreme Court decision decided that Francophone parents do not have a right to educate their children in Anglophone schools in Quebec. Immigrant parents have this right if their children have already received some education in English. Okay, and so again, this is a lot of government intervention, control, and influence into the lives of individuals. So if you're a French-speaking person living in Quebec and you wanted your child to have more opportunities by, let's say, going to an English-speaking school and gaining the ability to speak in both languages, that's going to be very difficult. As of 2005, the Supreme Court simply stated, well, you don't have that right. If you're French-speaking and your children, your family's in Quebec, you got to go to a French-speaking school. Okay. But if you're an immigrant, you came here from somewhere else, and maybe you had a mixture of education, the languages, you have more of a right, more freedom. I think you were asking about Métis stuff yesterday. So the Métis do not have a lot of historic treaties with the Canadian government. In fact, you may have learned in one of your earlier grades about Louis Riel and the Métis revolt, and the Métis have had a hard time in Canada, although maybe not the hardest of times from all the people who've been in Canada. Okay, now when they created Manitoba, which was done to appease some of the requests from the Métis people, part of Manitoba, the land set out for Métis people, was given to them, and they had their rights given to them at that time too. Okay, and they were given scrip, which is essentially a piece of paper, a document that allows you land. Okay, and so I don't know if they were allowed to take that, document and say, hey, I want 240 acres or whatever it is. I want my land in this area or that area. I don't know if they were stuck to Manitoba. So that would be a key, if that's the case, that's a key difference between many of the other indigenous groups and Métis groups. So the indigenous groups were given a reserve. They were told, on Treaty 6, you have several reserves. These are the places where you can live and do what you want. Right? Whereas Métis people may not have had that restriction. The Métis were given 12 temporary settlements in Alberta for them to do as they wish. Okay, they don't exactly have control of the land, but it is their land. If you really look into the history of how the government dealt with the Métis versus other indigenous groups, a lot of things were expedited or sped up. For Métis people, they didn't necessarily face the same amount of struggles that many other indigenous groups may have faced, although again, if you look at the history with Louis Riel, some of the more famous and original Métis individuals, again, their history was filled with conflict as well. So none of these settlements are near Edmonton. I guess the closest one is some of these purple ones here that we're seeing. They're all kind of more north of Edmonton. Okay, Leduc would be right down there, slightly south of Edmonton. And so again, building on that point, Métis people were more or less given autonomy and sovereignty over their affairs in their lands, in their established areas. That was done in 1990. There are many indigenous groups who are still fighting for that right to this day. It's not clear to me why the Métis were so successful, let's say, if we word it that way. But if you're an indigenous person and your peoples had been fighting since the 60s, let's say, 50s, 1950 and 60, for the right to manage your own affairs on your reserve land wherever, and to this day you still don't have that. How might you feel about? It'd be good to consider how they might feel about these decisions being made for Métis people that maybe aren't being extended to their own indigenous group. Here is the second last slide, close to the last few. Okay. Métis people were also given the right to hunt and fish due to their indigenous ancestry. And I believe when it says this, I guess there was like a 4-year period. I believe they were essentially allowed to do that as their right, not necessarily as a privilege. For those of you who went on that ice fishing trip, you had to take a course, you had to get a certificate, you had to educate yourself before you could go ice fishing. You're not allowed to just go out onto the lake and fish and take whatever you want. And even once you do get a license, you follow certain guidelines and rules. Right, so you wouldn't, generally speaking, I think with animals, particularly if you're hunting them rather than harvesting, which is what you might do with fish, they're generally more concerned with saving the female animal or part of that species than the male. Part of that just simple biology. If you want the population to either maintain or go up, don't shoot the female animal, because they're the ones that give birth. Now, obviously, you don't want to shoot all the male animals either, but they manage these things. Okay, in 2007, the Alberta or Canadian government, the Alberta government then restricts those same rights that were given to the Métis people just a few years prior, and they do not consult the Métis about that. You could see this ladder building up. You have these various, so it starts with the Royal Proclamation, 1763. You have Canada's Confederation, 1867, so Canada becomes a country, and they take sole responsibility for First Nations peoples. Okay, 1982, Section 35 of the Canada Act recognizes existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. Okay. Howley case in 2003, the Supreme Court of Canada rules that Métis people have the right to hunt and fish as one of the Aboriginal peoples under the Constitution. You can peruse through this process yourself as well. Okay, that wraps up chapter 4. Thank you very much.